have you guys seen the price of gas lately? I mean, at this point, it's a stupid question. Of course you have. And I'm sure many of you are feeling the pinch of higher gas prices no matter what vehicle it is that you drive. But I drive a big, massive truck that is especially bad on gas. But here's the thing, I don't actually need to drive this truck most of the time. I mean, sure, when I'm hauling materials and going on long road trips, it's really hard to beat. But what about my most common commute? Going from my home to the shop. It's about 10.5 kilometers away. What if I could do that trip with an electric vehicle that was a lot cheaper to run? One that I built myself.
In order to call this project a success and to have it replace my truck, I needed to satisfy two main criteria, both range and speed. And in order to properly evaluate speed, first I needed a baseline. So I grabbed my keys, a stopwatch, and headed from my place over to the shop.
So here we are at the shop. That trip door to door took 26 minutes and 35 seconds. So that is our time to beat. Can we do it? I don't know, but there's only one way to find out, so let's get started on this build. Step number one on this build is going to be building the deck of the board. And just like in my previous video, I am going to be using a DIY longboard kit from my friends over at Roar Rocket. Their DIY skateboard and longboard kits make making your own board ridiculously easy, and they're a local Toronto-based company, so I always enjoy working with them. But you know, if I had one complaint about Roar Rocket, it's that they almost make it too easy to make your own skateboard. So for this build, I decided to make things a little trickier for myself. You see, normally you would laminate the different layers of your skateboard using this stuff, wood glue. But I've decided to use epoxy instead, specifically Ecopoxy's Biopoxy 36, which is a laminating epoxy, although it's not really meant for wood use. You see, this stuff is more of an industrial product. Normally you would use this for laminating things like carbon fiber and fiberglass. However, I did have a conversation with a member of the R&D team over at Ecopoxy, and they told me they didn't see any reason why I couldn't use it for wood. They just didn't really guarantee that it would work either.
So, why use epoxy to make a skateboard deck? Well, it all comes down to durability. An epoxy board is going to be a lot stronger and a lot more resistant to water. Unfortunately, that durability comes at the cost of a more complicated lamination process. So complicated, in fact, that I'm actually going to break out the details of this step as a separate video. The cliff notes are that you only get like 30 minutes or so of working time, and you need to coat both sides of each layer. It was definitely a crunch to get it all done within that time frame, but thankfully I made it. And then it was time to do some vacuum forming. My shop vac got most of the air out, but for that last little bit, there's no real substitute for some good old-fashioned manual pumping. That's what she said.
Now, there's something that I'm a little worried about at this point. So a lot of you probably already know this, but as epoxy cures, it's an exothermic reaction, meaning that it generates heat. Now, one thing Ecopoxy told me to watch out for is along the sides where there's all the squeeze out, this might get so hot that it melts through the bag. I can already feel that there's quite a bit of heat coming through the midsection of the board. The sides aren't actually too bad, so we're just gonna have to kind of watch this and see. Another little thing that you might wanna watch out for is that this webbing here that allows the air to escape from the bag also sucked up some of the excess squeeze out epoxy and then into the little valve up here. So at the very least, this valve is going to be toast after this project and potentially even this whole bag. And if that wasn't bad enough, some of the epoxy also got sucked up onto the top of my Rocket lamb sheet here, which will potentially discolor it. So if you're doing this at home, one thing you might consider doing is putting some sort of protective film on your last layer so that you don't get any epoxy on it. And then we just wait and see if this thing melts down. So it's been a couple hours at this point. Most of the heat is gone from the core and the outside edges are starting to get really hard. So I think our epoxy is most of the way set. At this point, I think we can rule out the bag melting. However, we are gonna leave it overnight to continue curing because you don't get full cure on this epoxy until 72 hours. While we wait for that to happen, we're gonna get started on assembling some of the electronic skateboard components.
For this build, I honestly went a little bit overboard. I opted for a set of dual electric outboard motors that are capable of outputting a downright ridiculous 3,500 watts of power each. This should provide me with a nice balance between top speed, hill climbing ability, and face melting acceleration. And then, because I've never been one for the road well traveled, I added these pneumatic all-terrain wheels and tires so that I can go stupid fast over whatever terrain I want. Once I was done setting up the front and rear axles, I left for the night and gave the epoxy some much needed time to cure.
All right, it's been a little bit more than 24 hours. This is all feeling nice and cold, so I think we can start our demolding process, or debagging process, or whatever you want to call it. Let's see how it did. This is proving to be a little bit more difficult than I thought it would be. I mean, we'll put this in the minus category for working with epoxy. It's definitely a lot harder to get out of the bag than just normal wood glue. My arm's not long enough to reach down there. Most of the way free. Maybe. Oh, there we go. Victory. It took me 15 minutes. Whew. So came off of the mold pretty easily, so we can just get rid of that. But now I'm worried about this. So I want to get it off of there without doing damage, but I don't know how I can do that. So I think I'm just gonna try and grip and rip it.
Thankfully, the bottom of my board is a sheet of rocket lamb, and this stuff is crazy durable, so my grip and rip technique didn't do any damage, and I was able to get pretty aggressive while chipping off the rest of the baked on epoxy. Seriously, it didn't even mark it.
That is looking a lot better. Still not perfect, mind you, but it's good enough now to the point where we can cut it down to a more reasonable size, and we can worry about finishing the bottom of it and making it look nice a little later in the process.
I'm pretty sure that legally I'm compelled to tell you that a bandsaw is the best way to cut out a skateboard deck, but I don't have one of those, so we're just gonna muddle our way through it with these saws that I do have. I was actually really excited for this step because it gave me my first good clean look at a cross-section of the epoxy laminated wood.
So right off the bat, I can already tell based on these offcuts that this is gonna be quite a bit stiffer than your average board, which I think for my application is gonna be great. However, if I was gonna make like a street deck or just a regular longboard and do it with epoxy, I might think about removing a couple layers, maybe doing it with 6 layers as opposed to 7 or 8, just to preserve a little bit of that flexibility while still getting the same amount of durability.
This next step is a little bit weird, but just try to stay with me. I really like the shape of the last board I made, but it was a little bit too small for me. So I took that exact same template, cut it up into quarters, and then laid it on top of my new deck, effectively giving me the same shape, but longer and wider, which is perfect for my long and lanky body type. To cut the template, I went and grabbed my new cordless jigsaw, and let me just tell you guys, if you've still got a corded jigsaw, go ahead and throw that thing in the trash and go get yourself a cordless one. They are just so much more maneuverable without that stupid cord getting in your way, and honestly, it's just as powerful as my corded one. This next little bit is basically identical to my last skateboard build, so we're gonna power through it pretty quickly. I use my belt sander to clean up my jigsaw cuts and then round out all of the interior corners. And then I use my trim router to give the outside edge of the deck a nice comfortable to hold round over. From there, it was time to start drilling all the mounting points. For the trucks, I just disassembled them and used them as their own template. It's always a good idea to drill these holes from the bottom of your deck. That way, if you accidentally happen to drill at a slight angle, your holes will still be in the right location. With those out of the way, I then moved on to the battery compartment, which apparently needs a lot of screws to hold it in place. Lucky for me though, I had this foam gasket that made for a pretty great impromptu template. I just taped it down into position and then drilled right through it.
There we go. Now that we have all of the hardware holes drilled, we can talk about how we're gonna finish this thing and fix the glossiness on the bottom. So hear me out on this one. I figured that since it was epoxy that got me into this mess, maybe epoxy can get me out of this mess.
Here's the nice thing about epoxy. It self-levels and blends really well, so I just decided to roll on another full coat. Once it dries, it'll look like a single consistent layer and it'll give me a great weatherproof finish. Nobody, well, outside of you and me, will ever know that I screwed up earlier. I didn't really care too much about the top layer since that's gonna end up getting covered with grip tape later, but on the bottom and outside edges, I did take my time and I also used a heat gun to pop any little bubbles.
All right, while we wait for the epoxy to dry, we're gonna do some electronics. Now we're gonna talk about what each one of these individual pieces is, but before we do that, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to Mike Beard over at M-Boards. He helped me put together this whole kit and he's been really helpful throughout this whole process. So I will include some links to his channel and store in the video description.
This simple black plastic box is the battery enclosure, but really it houses all the electronics, which gets secured in place with some heavy-duty double-sided tape. The biggest component is obviously this monster battery, capable of outputting 135 amps at 43.2 volts. This is what's going to give me the range and power that I need to hopefully retire my truck. Next came the battery management system, which handles all of the charging and making sure that the battery doesn't self-immolate, which, you know, is kind of important. This just plugged right in, and then I used some heat shrink tubing to add a little bit of protection to all of the connectors. Then it was time to install the brain, or the ECS. I chose the Stormcore 60D Plus. This is responsible for receiving inputs from me and then outputting power to the motors. The nice thing about this one is that it's fully programmable and runs on open source software, which as a PC and Android user is kind of my jam. Oh, and how could I almost forget this cute little remote module that lets my handheld controller communicate directly with the ESC. As a final step, I plugged the motor leads into the ESC, heat shrink those connectors too, and then I was ready to test the thing.
Okay, I have hooked up the rear axle with the motors to it. I've connected my computer to the VASC in here and uploaded the latest firmware. So now it's time to do a test spin of the motors for the first time. This should detect how big the motors are and how much they're capable of, outputting. So this is the first time they will spin, theoretically, if I hit this button here. Oh, I hear a noise. It's going. It's a little scary. Oh my God, this thing is going to absolutely rip. So for the most part, this was all plug and play. However, there was one little thing that I got caught up on that I actually got Mike from M-Boards to help me out with that I think I should know for you guys. So this connector right here is the one that connects the receiver for the remote to the ESC. And what I had to do was remove this green wire and this orange wire and swap them in order to make them communicate with each other properly. All right, now that we got all of that sorted out, I think we are ready to finally assemble this thing and then maybe take it for test spin.
And, when I say assemble, what I really mean to say is install the grip tape. I kind of forgot that I had to do that before installing all the other components. On a positive note, since the last time I did this, I've actually learned a new trick. You can use a little tiny offcut of your grip tape to burnish the outside edge of your board. This makes it really clear where the edge is and makes cutting off all the excess grip tape a lot easier. After that was done, then it was time to assemble everything. I started with the front trucks and included these half-inch riser pads, which should give me some additional clearance so that my tires don't rub like a stanced-out Honda Civic. That part was pretty easy, but getting the battery compartment in place proved to be a little bit more difficult than I originally anticipated.
This goes on there like so. Toss a couple nuts on these bolts so that this doesn't go anywhere while I hook up the battery. Okay, I'm gonna try and get this on here. Really don't want any wires getting pinched, which I'm a little bit worried about. Maybe I'll start at this end, work my way up to the front. This is gonna be tricky. The bolts are just like a little too short, but I think once I compress around the gasket, then they'll get threaded on and it'll work.
Eventually, I worked out a system where I used a clamp to compress the gasket, which gave me just enough thread to get all of the nuts on. And of course, no skateboard build would be complete without some stickers, so I threw on one from Roar Rocket and one from M-Boards. Don't worry, I'll add my own later.
All right, everything is now all buttoned up, so what do you say we give this thing a little bit of a shock test, huh? Clear out a little bit of a runway for myself. Board's on, remote is on. Oh yeah. Yeah, that works. Whew. Here we go. Ooh, might need to tighten up the trucks a little bit, but yeah, that works. There we go. Ooh, 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 ooh. It's torquey. This thing is very torquey. All right, well, now that we know that it works, let's take this somewhere where there's a little bit more space so that I don't have a repeat of the last time I tried to test an electric skateboard in the shop. Oh, I just ate shit a little bit. So I'm down here on the bike path at the Leslie Street Spit right now because I figured there should be some nice long runways out here and not too many people around, hopefully. First impressions are that this thing moves pretty good. I can give it like 10% throttle right now. And honestly, I think if I want to go much faster than this, I should be wearing a helmet. So the controller's got a couple different modes you can use it in. I think low, medium, and high. And right now, this is plenty fast and low. First speed bump. You know what? Not too bad. I was kind of worried the battery might scrape. You know, I see why people get so addicted to electric cars because that instantaneous torque is so crazy. I'm in a quieter part of the park right now, and the roads are a little rougher out here, so it's giving me a good chance to test out the off-road capabilities of the board. You know how with like a normal skateboard, a little pebble can get caught under the wheel and can absolutely just throw you? That is not a concern with this thing. It is going over rocks, gravel, no problem. I'm not gonna lie, I am having an absolute blast riding this thing. Oh, another speed bump, gotta slow down, and then we are away. Let's do a quick accel test. I mean, yeah, now I'm already back up to cruising speed. Yeah, okay, that's fast enough. So I went all the way out to the furthest point. Now I want to ride back and do a little telemetry data recording so we can kind of get a sense of the range of this thing. I didn't start with full charge, so I won't know the exact range, but I will be able to kind of approximate it based on how far I go right now. I actually just drifted the rear wheels through some gravel there, so wheel spin is an issue that you're going to have to watch out for with something like this, which is wild to think about. I would not advise anybody build one of these unless you're very comfortable on a board. I've been riding skateboards, snowboards my entire life, and even this is a little bit scary for me. Some of you may notice that my vehicle today is a little differently. Infinity was kind enough to give me this big giant monstrosity of an SUV as a loaner car while I do an Instagram campaign with them. Pretty plush on the inside. I'm actually enjoying driving it versus my truck. Okay, so I just finished crunching the numbers. From the point to back here at the car was 6 kilometers, and that used up 21% of the battery. So not exactly the most confidence-inspiring number. That should give me about 30 kilometers of range, but going to the shop, there's a lot of uphill, which is going to eat a lot of battery, but also out there, the terrain was kind of rough, which also eats battery, so I think it's going to be too close to tell, and at this point, the only thing we can do is actually go and run the actual test. So let's go do that. Okay, so I think the official time to beat is 26 minutes, so I'm going to go ahead and start my stopwatch. We're going to hit the road. Honestly, riding downtown, not so bad. It's I'm on the bike path right now, so don't really have to worry about cars too much. It's relatively smooth through most parts of it, not too many potholes or anything to worry about. So honestly, so far the biggest speed impediment is cyclists in the bike lane, because I just go way faster than them. I have to be kind of careful not freak them out when I'm going around them. Are you going? Okay, all right. Thank you. So the next kilometer or so is gonna be like a straight uphill climb. So we're gonna see how much this affects the battery. This is probably the part that I'm worried the most about. I mean, I'm going uphill right now and I'm having no problem keeping up with this car in front of me. In fact, the car in front of me is kind of slowing me down a little bit. And this thing hill climbs like no problem. Still worried about what it's doing to the battery, but plenty of power to go uphill. All right, I think we made it to the top of the hill, and I gotta say, we're making better time than I thought. Hits like that I worry about hurting the board. Unfortunately, we are now over the time limit. I've just crossed over 27 minutes, but we are within a couple blocks of the shop, so I still might consider that a win. Okay, so it made it. According to my watch, that took me a little over 30 minutes, and I have 53% battery left, according to that. So it is gonna be cutting it real close on the way home. I don't know, let's hit the road and see if we can do it. You know, one thing I'm realizing is that I really should have got some tools with me in case anything goes wrong on this trip in order to repair the board, but we're just gonna pray that I torqued everything down the correct amounts on the first attempt. Gotta say, when you're out on the paved road and there's nobody around, it's really nice. Guy back there just taking a casual bong rip while walking down the street. Classic. this is it. This is the home stretch. I'm probably a couple blocks from my house right now. Still going strong, so I think we're gonna make it. Even if it didn't make it at this point, I would easily be able to walk home. Well, it made it. After a 25-kilometer round trip, this thing still has 15% battery life left. So, will this electric skateboard be replacing my truck? How much did it cost to make? And was it all worth it? Let's go talk about that. One thing that I've neglected to talk about so far in this video is just how much it cost to make this board, but I think we'd better sit down for this portion of the video because it's a lot. All right, that's a little bit better. So, all of the parts on this board, like the electronics, the trucks, the wheels, that cost me a little bit more than $1,500 US. And then to make the deck was probably another couple $100 on top of that. So yeah, it wasn't cheap, but at the same time, I didn't try to make it cheap either. I was trying to build my dream electric skateboard, not the best bang for your buck electric skateboard. And also, to help offset some of the costs, I sold my one wheel that I showed you in the last video. That was partially a pragmatic decision. I mean, I don't need 2 electric skateboards, but it was also kind of a protest because Future Motion, the company that makes the one wheel, has been engaging in some really dodgy anti-right to repair practices that I am personally not a fan of. My new board is completely DIY, it's running on open source software, and if I want to change, repair, or modify anything about it for any reason, I am free to do that. And that is very important to me because I plan to keep this thing for a very long time. All right, now for the big question. What about replacing my truck? Well, yeah, for the warmer weather months anyways. I mean, sure, it took me 4 extra minutes to get to the shop, but big deal. Given Toronto traffic, that might as well be a rounding error. I can also take this board to visit my friends, run errands in the city, and just cruise whenever I want to. With this kind of range, I'm really struggling to think of many scenarios where I wouldn't just grab this thing on the way out the door and go. So yeah, overall, I give this build 2 big thumbs up. It's probably the funnest thing that I've ever built. Sorry, everything console, I think you've officially been demoted. It's also scary fast, which is exactly what I wanted. I honestly haven't had this thing up to full speed yet because I've just been too afraid to ride it that fast. It can handle basically any terrain that I'd be likely to encounter here in the city, and most importantly, every time I ride this thing, it puts a big giant smile on my face. And on that note, I think that's probably the perfect spot to end this video. Thank you so much for watching. Big thank you to Roar Rocket for providing me with one of their DIY longboard kits. I also want to say a big thank you to Ecopoxy for giving me a little bit of Biopoxy 36 to try out in the frankly off-label use of making a skateboard. And then finally, I just wanted to say thank you to Mike and the whole team over at mboards.co. And then finally, before I forget, big thank you to all my Patreon supporters. That's probably the most important thank you. I couldn't make these videos without your guys' support, so I really appreciate it. I think the video description in this video is gonna be pretty cluttered with a lot of different things, but there's just a lot of stuff I wanted to share with you guys, so hopefully it's not too overwhelming. All right, I think that is it for me, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.
You're in my headphones, baby, in my headphones, baby, in my headphones, making me
Big sweeper. Man, this thing's fast.